Hey everybody, welcome to the crew. I'm Sea Lord Jenda, and this is the history of the world. We are now passing 2800 BCE. Human civilization is continuing to grow quickly in at least 4 different areas of the world. There are major river civilizations on the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yangtze, and the Yellow Rivers. In the west, agricultural civilization is spread through Mesopotamia and into Anatolia, the Levant, the Persian steppes, and the Greek islands. Egypt is unified under the rule of the second dynasty pharaoh Ninetjer, although the succession is uncertain at the moment. Sumeria is divided into numerous competing city-states. Uruk and Kish are probably the most prominent, but none are clearly dominant at this point. We don't know too much about the organization of the Chinese and Indus Valley civilizations because we have no translated written records from this time, but the Indus seem to be a bit more egalitarian than average, based on a lack of monumental structures, while China is pretty stratified, but China is also the most isolated. The Indus Valley civilization definitely trades regularly with Sumer and ultimately the Egyptians, probably via Sumer, whereas the Chinese are very much on their own out there. Now, technology is broadly quite advanced. The major metal in the world is actually still copper, but bronze is very much in existence, becoming more common, and is highly sought after. It's only lacking a good tin supply to use in making it on an industrial scale, so they're still dependent. We are still dependent mainly on arsenic bronze. Now, in Sumeria, there are extensive irrigation canals, complete with locks and dams, large ziggurats, city walls. The cart is in widespread use. In general, we are no longer living in uncivilized times, everybody. Civilization is here. Civilization is here with a bang. There's writing in both Sumer and Egypt, and honestly, in the Indus Valley as well, at least proto-writing. We just can't translate it, unfortunately. So, what's going on in the 2700s BCE? Well, in Sumeria, Enma-Baragisi of Kish apparently is leading a war against Elam, a rising culture on the Iranian plateau to the east, centered around the city of Susa, and he carries away as spoils the weapons of Elam. What exactly that means, hard to say, but it means he won for a certainty. Reliable sources, few and far between, but this is more or less the first properly documented war, or one of the very first, and also the first blow in what will become a lasting feud between the peoples of the Fertile Crescent and the peoples of the Iranian Plateau. Unfortunately, the Sumerian king list and the very few other political sources for this period are still highly fragmentary and unreliable, but it's pretty clear the city-state based system in Sumeria is well developed. There's probably a rivalry between Uruk and Kish for preeminence at this point, but the other cities are also mostly comparable at this point, at least the larger ones. Enma-Baragesi himself is supported by some fragmentary archaeological evidence, so we know he exists, but the king list claims a reign of 900 years for him, which is probably not accurate. Now, according to a later fellow named Herodotus, the city of Tyre is founded about this time, which would make it one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities, although there are a couple in Egypt and elsewhere in the Levant that beat it. But then again, Herodotus is writing about 2,000 years after this, so he doesn't really know, if we're being honest. Now, in the Greek islands, the Minoan civilization in particular has become increasingly developed, and by about 2650 at latest, is showing evidence of some pretty considerable trade with the other eastern Mediterranean civilizations, so we are really getting some maritime peoples up and running now. And in the very related Cyclades culture, this figure of a seated harp player made of marble was created about this time, which this figurine will happen to be fortunate enough to survive the ensuing millennia and will provide us with proof that the Minoans or the Cycladic people have the harp already at this point. And the craftsmanship is generally very impressive. There's void space. That marble arch is extremely delicate. And that brings us to Egypt, which is by far where we have the best records at this point, thanks to the desert preserving their very impressive tombs for posterity. Albeit, you should bear in mind everything at these states is still fragmentary, mostly uncertain information gleaned mainly from archaeological digs of said tombs and other sites. But Ninetjer sits the throne in 2700 BCE, and he's been reigning something on the order of 20 years already, and keeps reigning for a total of as much as about 40 years, a long and apparently pretty stable period. It seems he introduced a sort of bi-yearly census, which was conducted by his officials, an increasingly elaborate civil service and bureaucracy, which he definitely expanded. His court apparently traveled up and down the Nile touring the kingdom, and he was able to collect significantly more resources and taxes than previous pharaohs, it seems. Now, that's all well and good, but apparently upon his death is when the problems start. We're not sure quite if he splits his realm intentionally between his sons for ease of administration, or just that there was a civil war between Upper and Lower Egypt, maybe because of the center of power migrating northwards to Memphis. Actually, it's not even super clear that the split happens immediately on Ninetjer's death. Unfortunately, our information is just not solid. But even this isn't solid, but what seems to be true is that a split most likely did happen, or does happen. According to the king lists that we have, Ninetjer is succeeded by Wadjenes on the left there. That's the official word. But these king lists that we can use as sources were created 1,000 years or more later. There's no solid archaeological evidence from the time for Wadjenes. And there is one ruler who is attested archaeologically, buried at Abydos in the south with the first dynasty, one Seth Parabson. Now, he uses the Upper Egyptian god Set as his deity rather than the more commonly accepted Horus. Note the, if you see his Serek on the pot there, or the bowl, note the Set animal at the top of it, the sort of dog-like looking creature, the canine. Now, older theories used to suggest that he was some sort of heretic who was attempting to oppose a monotheistic religion centered around Set, but this has been mostly rejected by Egyptologists now. So what we believe is happening is that the country has either simply been split, either on purpose or because of civil war, and possibly Seth Parabson is choosing to prioritize Set as a symbol of Upper Egyptian identity, since Set is a more explicitly Upper Egyptian god. But not that he's trying to eliminate the other gods. And it may be that there is no civil war in Egypt, we can't say. Especially if Ninetjer intentionally did this, then there probably was no immediate war, so the split may be peaceful. And it does persist for pretty much the remainder of the century, although dating on this is very uncertain, in some cases as much as give or take 100 years. But the most likely scenario, assuming we accept that Egypt is divided, which seems to be the case, is that Wadjenes is succeeded in the north, Lower Egypt, by Senij, then Neferkara, Neferkasakar, and Hudjefa. Now, the last of those is especially unhelpful because this literally just means erased. and apparently means that even the creators of the king lists, which again, 1,000 or more years later themselves, didn't have the name of this guy. So these rulers are all attested on the king list, all 4 of them, but we don't have any real contemporary archaeological evidence for them, with very limited exceptions, such as this bit of stonework, but cartouche, I believe it's called, but most likely these were the rulers of Lower Egypt from the Memphis area, while Upper Egypt was ruled from probably Phoenix by first Seth Parabson and then Sekhemib Paranmat. And there's quite a lot more archaeological evidence for them because we found their tombs, or found one tomb and probably evidence of another in Abydos. It seems like they reorganized the bureaucracy, probably to limit the power it had gained under Ninetjer. And all of these debates are very much complicated by the matter of religion. The use of Set as the patron of Seth Parabsen, and also the appearance of the sun on some of the serics of the Upper Kings, which may mean that the sun cult is really gaining prominence in Egypt in earnest. There's no, they don't have a sun god as such yet, or rather it's an aspect or under the envelope of Horus, but it seems like maybe there's a push towards creating a sun god independently. So, I mean, unfortunately, barring the discovery of further evidence, not impossible if some tombs could yet be lying undiscovered out in the desert, buried under other monuments where we haven't found them. Barring that, we can't fully reconcile the available information, but it seems that as we reach 2700 BCE, Egypt is split between lower and upper rulers, perhaps cooperative towards each other rather than hostile, but split and maybe a bit chaotic as a result. None of them are achieving enormous architectural feats or anything like that, or leaving very good records behind. And that brings us to 2600 BCE, or on into the 2600s BCE at least. So I didn't really mention them too much before. A note on China. The Longshan culture has continued there through these last 200 years, 28 to 2600, with precious little in the way of any certain dating or information to say what might be changing. The best available records of sorts put this as the basically mythical period of 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors. These are definitely not entirely real. The legends might be based in some kind of fact or oral tradition passed down, but it's impossible to say what the original facts were. I mean, certainly something was happening. There was a settled civilization, they just didn't leave good written records. So, it's likely that there were some sort of powerful rulers doing their thing at some point, and perhaps their feats were passed down as the legend of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, but that's essentially wild guesswork. There's absolutely no real proof for it. And any oral tradition passed down 1,000+ years is going to bear only a limited relationship to the actual facts. Some relationship, but not anything you could say is hard evidence. Meanwhile, down in India, the Indus River Valley civilization has reached a mature form. There is plentiful evidence at this point that cities large enough to rival their neighbors to the west have grown, most prominently Harappa on the upper Indus, or really on the Ravi branch, but tributary that is. But quite a number of cities, numerous, spread across a large area through the whole Indus Valley. And it would be a mistake to think that these are too far behind Samaria and Egypt. All of the cities have particularly impressive artificial reservoirs and drainage and sewage systems. This is one of them that features essentially a covered drain at the roadside. This leads out of an individual house to the roadside system in much the same, I mean, much less sort of sophisticated, but the same sort of principle as modern piping. Um, so these covered drains at the roadsides, a very advanced water system. Many of the cities are walled. The civilization as a whole, they grow barley along with some wheat. Likely they imported the wheat from Samaria. That's during the winter, and then in summer they grow rice and millet. They depend almost entirely on the seasonal floods of the Indus for irrigation. Interestingly, that is the one area they do fall behind, although their water systems with this drainage and sewage and all seem to be quite impressive. It seems like because of the power of the seasonal floods of the Indus at this time, they've never really had a push to develop a good irrigation system as such, so they don't have a lot of broader water control technology the way Samaria does. However, their metallurgy skills are pretty much equal to the West. They're fully able to make copper and bronze tools. Now, bronze is still quite expensive throughout the world. Still no tin. Someone tell me where to find tin. But it's probably safe to say that by this point, and for the next several hundred years, the Indus River Valley civilization is, in most practical aspects, pretty much a match for the Sumerian and Egyptian civilizations, and probably ahead of the Chinese civilization, honestly. It's just that certain information is highly scarce because while Sumeria has cuneiform, or at least like proto-cuneiform, really, sort of at this point still, and Egypt has hieroglyphs, very early ones, the Indus Valley civilization has some writing. This, probably proto-writing as opposed to proper writing, because almost all the examples are only sort of this long, a matter of a few symbols. But we found something on the order of 400 to 600 symbols on various ceramics and such that have been excavated and other things. Probably not a true writing system from their mass. But the fundamental problem is we cannot read this. We have no Rosetta Stone for this, which absolutely critical to the understanding of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Everything that I say here about Egypt, if there was no Rosetta Stone, we might never have known practically any of this. And unfortunately, we don't have such a thing for the Indus Valley civilization. We can't read any of this writing. If we could, if somehow we ever could translate it, we might learn quite a lot more about this impressive but rather enigmatic civilization yet. Also notable, there aren't really a lot of monumental structures in the Indus Valley civilization. I mean, some of the reservoirs and such are quite impressive, but... and the cities in general, they even have some of them walls, but they don't have any ziggurats or pyramids or anything really fancy like that. It doesn't seem like it was probably a resource or population issue. It may indicate that they had a much more egalitarian leadership or wealth distribution system, or a less grandiose religious system. But again, it's just impossible to know exactly. I mean, between the inability to translate the language and the lack of big headliner monuments, unfortunately, awareness of this civilization in general has always been kind of low throughout the world. The wider world, at least. I'm pretty sure locally it's fairly well known now. But not helped by the ultimate sort of failure to thrive of this civilization in the very long term, but we will get to that in 700 years. Meanwhile, the Americas are still home only to sort of fleeting settlements. There's no major settled civilization there. As I've mentioned before, maize has been domesticated, but that's not on its own enough to support large settled civilizations. Now, around this time, the Maya, or their direct predecessors, are beginning to emerge in the area of what's now Belize, although They don't have major sedentary settlements yet either, so it's sort of more of a note of interest than any kind of real civilization building at this stage. Back in Samaria, we are still in what's called the early dynastic period, which is unfortunately sort of semi-legendary at best. Although they do have writing we can read, their king lists are all from hundreds, if not thousands of years later, and as such aren't exactly reliable for this period. Many of them claim extravagant, hundreds of years long, godlike reigns for their kings. It is about this time. This image is of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, one of the most iconic figures from ancient Samaria, and it's about this time that he may have ruled over Uruk. Whether he's a real person, probably, but not certainly. It's mostly linked to, we're pretty sure Enma Baragisi of Kish is real, because we found some archaeological evidence for that. And his successor, Aga, is explicitly described interacting with Gilgamesh in some of the literature, but that doesn't necessarily mean Gilgamesh was real, and without a doubt, obviously, he didn't accomplish the miraculous feats claimed in the poems. What we can say is that Uruk was still certainly a very powerful city at this time, maybe even still first among equals, at least in southern Samaria. I mean, there's definitely a host of cities of comparable power around it at this point, in the Sumerian-speaking south and upriver in the Semitic-speaking north. And the difference in population density between the south and north is probably slowly shrinking. The south is fairly densely populated. There's more room to grow in the north. We do have the old Babylonian poem Gilgamesh and Aga, which, of all the poems written about Gilgamesh, is the most plausible or least supernatural, although, like all the others, it was written more than 500 years after this time. But it describes an attempt by Aga of Kish to besiege Uruk, which is repulsed by Gilgamesh. Now, this, for me at least, passes the sniff test of Kish may have attempted to besiege Uruk and was repulsed. Certainly, the city-states are warring amongst themselves by this time. But the majority of the epics are quite explicitly supernatural, so they have to be treated with plentiful skepticism. But speaking of epics, although the actual famed tales of Gilgamesh the King won't be written for over 500 years yet, the oldest known pieces of literature have been written, in the sense of being creative writing rather than just business or record keeping. This is the Instructions of Sharupak, which is a piece of wisdom literature, basically a book of, not a book exactly, more of a tablet, but of sayings and pieces of advice, framed as being from an ancient king to his son, but essentially a story of, not a story, but kind of it's an advice book. If they had more page space, it would be the equivalent of a book of fables or something. And then within the realm of chronological doubt with it for being first, there's also the Kesh Temple hymn, which is a hymn of praise, sort of essentially to the god Enlil and his connection to the city of Kesh. One of these is the oldest extant piece of literature. Meanwhile, in Egypt, we reached 2700, with the country still probably divided in two. But although this has probably been ongoing for potentially as much as a century, perhaps as little as a few decades, depending on the dating, which is super unclear. But in about 2690, that all finally comes to an end, thanks to the pharaoh Kasekemwi. who is the first largely undisputed pharaoh since Ninetjer. We don't know that much about Khafre, but he interestingly uses the symbols of both Horus and Set on his Serek, which is probably a symbolic attempt at reconciliation. It may very, very well have been a violent conclusion to the split. Khafre may have reunified Egypt by force, or one of the lines might have died out, but in any case, he probably had to make some efforts at reconciliation. He also does build several significant stone structures, including quite a large tomb at Abydos alongside the First Dynasty, rather than the earlier members of his own Second Dynasty. Of course, the dynasties are more of for the convenience of later archaeologists. We're not necessarily at all sure that they represent actual familial ties, especially not in these very early days. He is also the first ruler to have a significant statuary of himself. Here is, in fact, a surviving statue of Khafre. He was wed to Nemothop, likely a princess of the Northern Dynasty, assuming, as we think, that Khafre was most likely from the Southern branch, and had at least 2 children, likely as many as 5. He reigns for about 18 years and is succeeded by his son Djoser, who is counted the founder of the Third Dynasty of Egypt and the inaugurator of what we call the Old Kingdom of Egypt. Djoser might be briefly preceded by a brother named Nebka, but that's very unclear. For our purposes, we'll assume Djoser is the next pharaoh, taking the throne about 2670 BCE. Some estimates do put this as much as 100 years later. There's still a lot of uncertainty in these days. He's wed to Hetepfernebti, who's likely his sister. Still, at this point, that's already a classic pharaoh thing to do, basically. He has a fairly long, seemingly prosperous reign, which does include several military expeditions to the Sinai, where he subdues the inhabitants and begins mining for copper and turquoise, something which pretty much all his successors in the Third Dynasty and the Old Kingdom in general will keep up as long as Egypt has the strength. Aside from that, he is by far best known, and really called the start of his Third Dynasty and Old Kingdom because of his most monumental building project, the Pyramid of Djoser, built at the Saqqara necropolis used by the early Second Dynasty, since the capital is Memphis again now. Now, this project is overseen by his chancellor Imhotep, who ends up being posthumously venerated for millennia to the point of becoming recognized as a god of medicine, which is a very rare distinction for a non-pharaoh, but even within his life, he is a very trusted and valued advisor to the pharaoh, author of famous wisdom texts. Not more important than the pharaoh, but a very, very significant civil servant in early Egypt here. Now, the pyramid itself seems to begin life as an impressive, a very large, but not a unique a mastaba, like those that have been used by the Egyptian royalty for a long time. A sort of, slice off any one of the levels of this pyramid you're seeing, and you have a mastaba. It's a flat-roofed tomb structure. But at some point during his reign, which is long, very long, at least 20 years and probably more, a second mastaba is built atop the first, and then more until we get this 6-tiered step pyramid, which the original height of 30 feet reaches 200 in the end, or from 9 up to 60 meters. Now, the full extent of the tomb is way more than the pyramid, of course. It encompasses buried passages, outbuildings, mortuary cult housings, and so on, but that sort of level of detail is beyond the scope of this. For our purposes, we just have to say this enormous limestone structure, which is far larger than any previous Egyptian tomb, represents the beginning of a very distinct new period in Egyptian tomb building, which is handy since the tombs are our main source of information on most of these rulers, to be honest with you. So Djoser, as I said, rules at least 19 years, possibly as many as 28 or 29, and probably dies about 2650 BCE and is buried in his monumental pyramid. Now, his successor isn't entirely certain. We only know for certain of one child he had, a daughter named Inikawis. Most likely, he's followed by one Sekhemket, who rules only 6 or 7 years and is unable to complete a tomb of his own. It was apparently intended to be an even larger step pyramid, but all that survives is a half-buried mastaba of sorts built a few hundred meters away from Djoser's pyramid. Tomb aside, we don't know much of Sekhemket's reign. He keeps up Egypt's presence in the Sinai, which is why we have this image that you see. It's him in the Sinai, battering on the locals, as one does. Classic pose for pharaohs, really. I forget what they actually call it, but the conquest pose. Smiting. I think smiting maybe is just what they call it. But in any case, he is maybe married to a certain Yesaret Nebti, but this is very uncertain also. We don't know very much about him. But he is succeeded most likely by Zanacht, who, well, the chronology is very uncertain. The king lists that we have are super contradictory, and there's not great archaeological evidence. But, well, sources give Zanacht a reign of 18 years. This was probably shorter. There's not even a good or a clearly found unfinished grand tomb. The archaeological evidence for him in general is minimal. There's something that might be a mastaba for him, which contains the remains of an exceptionally large man, I should say. So Zanacht may actually be the first known case of gigantism. The corpse in this mastaba is 6.5 feet tall, which is at least a foot taller than the average of the time, probably more. But the identification of this tomb is not certain, and it's not large by the standards of these pharaohs in any case, so most likely his reign was short, didn't contain much of great importance. He did maintain the presence in the Sinai, and he is most likely succeeded by Kaba, although this chronology is still very uncertain. We know for certainty Kaba is a pharaoh of the Third Dynasty, complete with a ruined, half-finished step pyramid at the necropolis of Zayed al-Aryan. But where in the dynasty he falls, not very clear. The king lists are highly contradictory. This is chronology that I'm giving you is basically the best estimate of our Egyptian experts, but he probably reigns only another 6 years himself, which partially explains the limited available evidence, and is succeeded by Huni. Or he may have been the same person as Huni. That's ambiguous somehow. Not an expert on the translation struggles, but I'm told that it is ambiguous somehow. Huni takes the throne probably about or just before 2630 BCE and apparently rules about 20 or 24 years. The most commonly accepted death date is about 2613 BCE, although that's definitely put a big circa next to that. But the reign length and his name and all is widely accepted. There is actually supporting evidence from inscriptions on tombs of officials during his reign. It would have been a long reign and a prosperous one. The Old Kingdom really actually was entering its heyday under Huni. There's pretty good evidence that there was a significant civil service structure functioning again, nomarchs and viziers exercising local authority on behalf of the pharaoh. Huni seems to have engaged in numerous building projects, but unfortunately there is next to no solid information on what exactly he did. There's no tomb at all clearly attributed to him. The Mitam Pyramid might be his, but it's been severely plundered, so we can't be certain. It's probably the best candidate, especially it's sort of unthinkable that he would have a long and successful reign but not have any kind of pyramid or tomb, but we think the Mitam Pyramid is the work of his successor, or at least was continued by his successor, so Unfortunately, we don't know exactly what Huni's intended tomb was, or any very solid information. But he's succeeded by Sneferu. Sneferu here founds the 4th dynasty of Egypt. Quite a feat for a man who's missing half of his body, as you can see in this image. Um, but as I just said, the Old Kingdom is well established and thriving by this point, really entering its heyday. It stretches from the Mediterranean far south along the Nile, all the way up to the borders of what the Egyptians call Nubia. Not that Nubia is really exactly a country, it's one of the hunter gatherer regions that lies still outside of settled agriculture, but it has a well established presence on the Sinai Peninsula and along the coast to interact with the Libyans. Um, it's been a pretty prosperous 100 years, really, the 2600s, and that sets the stage for the feats that the 4th dynasty will shortly attempt, both architectural and military. Sneferu, as the founder of the dynasty, will very much set the tone and will be quite a martial ruler as well as a builder. So he takes the throne about 2613, give or take 10 years, and he reigns for 24 years at the very least, most likely 30 or more. His known consort is Hetepheres I. He probably had a lot, but Hetepheres will be mother of the following king. And he is a great builder who will construct no less than 3 pyramids in his reign. Pyramid number 1, the Mitam Pyramid, might have been started by Huni. We're not totally sure. But Sneferu probably at least continued it. It started life as a large step pyramid, probably a 7-step pyramid, quite similar, of course, to Djoser's pyramid, which is actually the only other step pyramid that was properly finished. But then it gained an 8th step pretty late on in its life cycle, probably. I mean, there's definitely an element of one-upping amongst the pharaohs, for sure, of their predecessors. But then as a final improvement, someone, probably Sneferu, decides they should fill the steps in with additional limestone, which will create sort of... You can see what happened here looking at this imagery. This limestone being the outer casing. Well, it's all limestone, but they attempted to fill the steps in with what you can see is half finished or ruined sort of outer casing here. This would, if completed, have resulted in something of a traditional smooth-sided pyramid shape. Unfortunately, it had never been designed for this. The outer layer did not have a good foundation. It was basically being built on sand, whereas the actual step pyramid has a rock foundation dug out for it. And the steps themselves were never designed to hold all that in place either. They're sloped wrong for it. And so it's possible they managed to complete it, and it's just considered unsatisfactory. But most likely, we think construction was never even finished. There's probably a downpour, and the whole structure just gives way and collapses, leading to something resembling its current state. This is supported by the fact that the internal decorations in the burial chamber are never really finished, so construction is probably abandoned after the collapse, and Sneferu starts over. New pyramid. The Mitam Pyramid, no good. Pyramid number 2. Intended from the start to be smooth-sided. Now he builds this at a 54-degree angle up from the desert, which is quite steep. Actually, he starts at probably at 58 or 60 degrees, but they have to cut it back to 54 almost immediately because that's just unworkable with the techniques and materials available. Unfortunately for Sneferu, 54 degrees is also too much for what they've got available. As the construction goes on, it seems that the pyramid probably showed increasing signs of instability, and construction was probably halfway or so complete, and they had to cut the angle back to 43 degrees which results in what you see here, the bent pyramid that still stands today. Now, I mean, it's close. It's by far the closest to the very classic pyramid shape, of course, but it's imperfect. It's bent. You can see that it's bent. Presumably, this was not considered acceptable for a pharaoh's tomb, and seeing as Sneferu was still alive, he goes ahead and starts building a third pyramid. But to find out if he finally gets that smooth side, you'll have to wait for the next episode, because that's in the 2500s, probably. Now, it must be said, and these pyramids, very impressive, very large structures. I mean, these are all, look, spoilers, but there'll later be this thing called a truck, and you can see one in the corner of this image. And just as a brief comparison to that pyramid. Yeah, these don't come cheap. Probably Sneferu struggles to acquire all the labor and materials he needs from his own lands, and so he campaigns abroad. He extends Egyptian power and influence. He leads at least one campaign south to Nubia, where he captures 7,000 prisoners, 20,000 head of cattle, sheep, and goats. He leads another campaign west to Libya, where he takes 11,000 prisoners and 13,000 head of cattle. Now, honestly, the populations of these areas were probably not that large. They had limited to non-existent sedentary or settled civilization. So these campaigns were probably extremely devastating to Nubia and Libya, to the point that it's been theorized they contributed to a turnover from what's called the AB group to the C group culture in Nubia, just from the sheer devastation of the existing culture. Aside from that, Sneferu does continue to exploit the turquoise mines in the Zanai. He doesn't campaign into Lebanon, or at least we don't have any evidence for it, but he does import quite considerable quantities of cedar wood along the coast from Lebanon, which he uses to build ships, both for the Nile and probably for coastal trade in the eastern Mediterranean by this time. Now, these cedar wood ships, of course, well, Egypt is a bit light on wood, fairly deserty at best, but these cedar wood ships, of course, are a lot more robust than the reed boats that have been common on the Nile up to this point. And one of these ships, the Praise of the Two Lands, is the oldest ship known to have been named. So that's a big step forward for all ship kind. So by 2600, the Old Kingdom here is in its heyday. As I've said several times before, it's dominant from Libya to the Zanai to Nubia. There's essentially no real threats to it. I mean, honestly, all three immediately neighboring regions that I've just named have just been crushed within Sneferu's reign by successful campaigns. It's very prosperous. They're constructing impossibly grandiose monuments, certainly the largest monuments in the known world at this time, and it's under a long-lived and evidently quite capable pharaoh. So, 2600 BCE. Civilization is thriving. Sumeria is divided, but more densely populated than ever. Competition for resources is causing increased fighting amongst the city-states, but nothing that's going to cause the downfall of civilization or anything, just getting a bit bloodier. The Egyptian Old Kingdom, well-established, stable, very prosperous, probably the single most powerful country in the world by quite some margin. I mean, that's educated guesswork. We don't have the numbers to make a hard estimate of that, but most probably. The Indus River Valley, a very large and thriving civilization of its own, to only a slightly lesser extent the same on the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. The Americas, still essentially devoid of settled civilization, but far from uninhabited. And the process is, I mean, maize has already been domesticated, and other domestic plants and animals are probably slowly coming along as the hunter-gatherers there sort of take up herding in some areas, or plant plants to come back to the next year. They haven't reached the agricultural revolution that happened in Mesopotamia yet, but it's definitely not outside the realm of possibility that they might do so in another couple thousand years. Bronze, still slowly spreading. It's very reasonable to call this the Bronze Age. It's especially for weapons. It definitely is in use. That pesky tin shortage is just still kind of limiting it. A lot of what's in use is still arsenic bronze, which is, as I described in a previous episode, is quite dangerous to make. But bronze is around. Bronze is more and more common, for sure. Written language still developing. And we've seen the emergence of literature, which demonstrates the uses for written language are really starting to multiply, and the number of words in the written language are multiplying. So, the potential of that is incredible. So how far will the pharaohs push these ambitious building plans? Third time the charm for Sneferu, or is the man going to have to be buried in a bent pyramid? Who will rise to the top of that Sumerian mosh pit, if anyone? Subscribe and tune in next time to find out. Thanks for watching, everybody.